I talked about things around the way people were feeling about trying to balance their career with raising children, seeing some of the rush and fatigue that people were feeling about the way they were expected to work, but just this underlying sort of bubbling sensation that the way we were working was getting a bit out of whack with human aspiration.
Would you do it differently again?
If you're a little bit curious like me and you love hearing from some super smart people, I think you'll get a lot out of this show. Welcome to The Thought Follower. I'm Joe Mackay. I've always had a lot of questions about life, and this show is my quest to find some answers. Each week, I'll chat to a thought leader to hear what's going on in their space. Let's jump into the next episode. So my guest on The Thought Follower today describes himself as an author, former journalist, newspaper editor, been a COO, a marketer, and a strategist. I came across you from one of your LinkedIn articles that's now been viewed over 6 million times on LinkedIn. Shane Rodgers, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joe. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I want to jump straight in and talk about the now famous or infamous article. I still remember scrolling through LinkedIn as a 25, probably 26-year-old at the time, seeing this article, the career advice I wish I had at 25. It resonated with me straight away, and obviously it's had a very wide appeal since then. Can you tell us about your experience in writing that article and seeing the success it's had?
Sure. And I guess it's one of those things in life where it surprises you and you don't see it coming. So that particular article was written really late one Saturday night, which is usually not a great time to be writing social media content. And I'd written a few other things and hadn't thought too much about it. At that point, I'd written a few articles that were getting hundreds of reads, occasionally thousands, but yeah, nothing particularly spectacular. And I think the next morning I got up and I just had a look at LinkedIn to see how the article was going. And I think at that point it had been read 5,000 or 6,000 times. And I thought, wow, that's odd on a Saturday night. Who's reading that in the middle of the night? And then I thought, oh, well, that's good. That's a good audience. I'm happy with that, and thought job done. And then over the coming days and weeks, it just kept growing and it kept growing and it kept growing. And then I started to get likes from all over the world, and then I started getting comments from all over the world. And I think that would have been in about 2015.
Yeah.
And from that time, like anyone who's on LinkedIn, you get on there and you get notifications. I think for probably 4 years straight after 2015, there wasn't once where I ever went onto my computer or my phone and there wasn't a notification or a message or something related to that particular article. So it somehow hit a nerve, and it took me a long time to work out why. But I think when I look back now, what had happened is it was me writing about things that people were starting to feel but didn't really have a way of articulating. And a lot of people said, I get that now. And I talked about things around the way people were living, I think the way people were feeling about trying to balance their career with raising children, and I can think some of the rush and fatigue that people were feeling about the way they were expected to work, but just this underlying sort of bubbling sensation that the way we were working was getting a bit out of whack with human aspiration. And I think that's what hit the nerve.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it definitely did. As I said, I was about 25 at the time, so it stuck out to me at that point and felt like really wise advice. And I think it did touch on, maybe anxiety or just difficulty, pressures around work. Do you think it's gotten better or worse since then?
Look, I think COVID changed the game. I think before COVID, there was just this unnerving kind of feeling, because I think I used to get a lot of emails, particularly from women, who were saying, you know what, I'm trying to raise children, I'm trying to do work. I feel guilty every time I have to go and do something for the children. I feel like I'm always asking permission. I feel like I'm always apologising. There was a really strong sentiment there. But I think with men, I had a lot of really interesting long emails from men who just said, you know what, I've got little kids, they're growing up, I'm exhausted all the time. Every time I see my kids, they seem to be a little bit older and a little bit taller. And I think that sort of really, there's just a disquiet there. And then I think the pandemic hit, and then suddenly we were forced to do a more flexible work arrangement, and all the things people were craving suddenly became possible. People actually finally had permission to live the way they wanted to, and I think that really changed the game overnight. So I think it has changed, but if not for the pandemic, I think it would have been a lot slower. But it's like a lot of things, you get a crisis and structural change that's bubbling below the surface suddenly goes into hyperdrive. I think that's what we saw.
So the creator economy, and particularly on, I think it's filtering into LinkedIn now. It's been on Instagram for a long period of time, and now LinkedIn as a creator economy is really booming. So what you achieved in 2015, there'll be a lot of people out there now aspiring to go viral and have that happen. Did it change your life in any way?
I think it changed it in a lot of ways. I think it opened up a vast international network. So I think prior to that, most of the following I had was based in Australia, but suddenly it was almost like that particular article, it kept jumping to new countries. It'd be running through Australia and then it'd jump to the UK, then it'd jump to the US. At one point I had an email from the education department, I think it was in Czechoslovakia, asking for permission to translate the article to distribute to students through that system. It had jumped into Singapore, and I had CEOs of companies saying, look, I've just printed this out and I've required all of my 200 staff to read it. I've had friends from Brisbane say that they were in Hawaii, and one particular person who was quoted in the article said that they met somebody in Hawaii, and this person's quite well known in their own right, but they said, oh yeah, I know you were quoted in that article that was on LinkedIn. So it's really bizarre. It just ended up popping up all over the world. Just one of those bizarre things that happens.
Yeah, that's amazing. So I think and I'm 34 now, probably my favourite piece of advice in the article is always act like you're 35 at work. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so I think this is something you get from the perspective of age, but I think, yeah, you're probably too young to relate to this, but you very quickly go from the youngest person in the room to the oldest person in the room.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, when I was really young and I was a young journalist, I remember interviewing a coal miner who was retiring after 40 years in coal mines. And he looked at me and I said to him, look, how have you done 40 years in the one job? And he looked at me and said, it was only yesterday I was your age. He said, I don't feel any different. Inside my head, I feel the same. I might look older, but I'm the same. And I think that sort of stayed with me. So I think the idea of being 35 in the workforce is you've got to keep that youthful energy and not let ageism or the fact that you're getting older change your mindset about what you can achieve. But similarly, there's plenty of 22-year-olds who are brilliant and capable of doing all sorts of things. They don't have to wait it out. There's no magic age where you suddenly know enough to do the next job. So 35 feels like the sort of age where you've got enough world experience to bring experience as well as training, if you like, and qualifications. But you've still got that really strong youthful energy. So I think it was the age where I said, okay, that's where you optimize your value, stay there, and you can keep working till you're 90 with the right mindset.
Yeah, interesting. I think as well with getting older, and I now work at a tech business and do often feel on the older side of the cohort, but using your experience where it can help, but also not letting it get in the way, I think as well. The way that the world has changed, that youthful exuberance and different younger perspectives, the situation can often be different than it was when I was in younger environments. So I think being open, even as you get more experience, to other opinions is so important. It becomes more important. The more experience you get, almost the more important it becomes to sit and listen and hear other viewpoints.
Yeah, look, I think that's right. And I think the other interesting perspective with age is you don't have to provide the same skills and the same value to the workplace at every age. So I look back and I think there's some things that I could do in my 20s and 30s that I was better at then. Because I had the energy, I had the enthusiasm, I could work all day and all night without it being any risk to health. Now my big value is experience. I've seen lots of scenarios. I've still got enthusiasm, but my ability to take a whole lot of experience and tie strands together to anticipate how things might play out, and also seeing things from a longer historical perspective. So that's a very different offering and just as important, but I think understanding that. And there's a lot of research and schools of thought around how humans peak at their capacity. So if you look at like the Beatles, they stayed together for 10 years and everyone's saying, get back together, do more. But their belief was that was such a really stellar body of work over 10 years that whether they could keep doing that at that level over a period of time. And if you look back, a lot of the really big achievers have a period in history where they do absolutely stellar work. They're still valuable after that, but it's really hard to keep performing in the same way at the same level decade after decade.
Yeah, and that ties in, that's another piece in your original article about a career is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And that's definitely a shift that I've felt over the last few years, and particularly having kids. In my situation, you do realise that all that energy, all that time, if it's going to work, it's not going to your family, and those are finite resources, and you need to choose where you're allocating them.
Absolutely. I think that one of the really big aha moments in that original LinkedIn article that you've referred to a few times is when I talked about children just passing through. And it's a really big wake-up call for people, and it was to me as well. When you look at your 2-year-old child or your 4-year-old child, and then you fast forward to your 20-something-year-old child, they're the same person, but they aren't. And that sort of wide-eyed newness of a really young child, that is so fleeting. And it was a little scary at first, but I had so many people who wrote to me and said, I actually gave up my job within 2 days of reading that article. I had people saying, I took my children on a 6-month road trip. And part of me said, oh, seriously, okay, have I pushed people too far there? But it's funny, even a couple of years later, I've had people calling me or emailing me and say, it changed my life. And I'm so grateful for that period of time I had with my children, because you're right, they were just passing through.
Yeah, and I think the other way you put it is works, like careers taking childhoods and not giving them back. I think that's such a powerful one. I've got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old now, so I'm right in the thick of all those great moments, and probably don't fully appreciate how fleeting they will be, but feel prepared and feel like I'm doing the best I can to make that effort now. So aside from the article, you've got a book out at the moment called Worknado. I love the title. Where did it come from?
I think it came from that whole genre around Sharknado originally, but I think the idea of tornadoes combined with anything now is conjuring up powerful imagery. But in a sense, it felt right too, because it's not just a little bit of a shake-up going in the way we work. It is a seriously big shake-up going on at the moment, and more to come. So I think the idea of Worknado is just saying that we're in a period of major change, and it's not slowing down. If anything, it's speeding up.
So you mentioned there a lot more change to come. What would you see as the number one thing you envisage changing?
Look, I think at its heart, the number one thing is humans moving to a different level of activity. And we've seen this. So you had the computer age followed by the digital age, and that saw a whole lot of things that humans had done for a very long time taken over by digital technology or machines that could do it probably better, but certainly more efficiently. And we said humans don't need to do this anymore because we can do this through technology. That took away literally millions of jobs and created millions more. And most of the research would suggest it was about a net 15 million job net growth off the back of digital and computer technology. So despite all the shock, horror and loss of jobs, the human race moved to different planes. When you look at the AI revolution, which is the next big wave coming through, we're now getting to a critical mass point on that will push humans again to somewhere else. And I think that's the really interesting thing. What roles, what jobs, what things, what endeavours will the human race do once we're cleared to do things that aren't quite so systematic?
I mean, you can't look anywhere on the internet without reading about AI and hearing a lot of different opinions on AI. Someone who I really respect in the space is Yuval Noah Harari, who has raised this idea that we know that AI is going to be a fundamental shift, but what he frames it as moving into a space where AI will now could potentially create history, customs and traditions that they're not based in human experience. They can feel like they are, but they may be completely new. They're not really based on anything we've lived, where anything up until now, so the computer age, the digital age, has been speeding up things that we already had. The AI phase literally could create new customs for us and could be used in all sorts of very powerful positive and negative ways. Do you think, and people like Musk and a few others have, started to petition and say we need to really look at this before we get to that tipping point. What do you think happens next?
So interesting. I think science fiction has got a really good record in anticipating these things. I think if you actually look at the way science fiction has been depicting robots and AI technology for a very long time, they nicely place the robots and that level of intelligence as intelligent, useful companions to the human race. And in most cases, you don't see the robots leading the expedition or making the calls or doing the creative problem solving and complex matters, but they're the intelligent, supportive, highly intelligent member of the team to do that. And to me, that's probably about right. I think if you look at generative AI or a lot of the AI that's available now, most of it we're not ready to substitute with, but it's a useful add-on to what we do. I actually wrote something in the last 24 hours around the Lost in Space robot, because I thought the 1960s Lost in Space, that robot, intelligent companion, unlimited knowledge almost, but it provided the intelligence and the knowledge, but not the wisdom or the leadership. And I think there's quite a clear distinction there with the human race.
Hey, it's Joe here. I hope you're enjoying the episode. Every chat in season 1 of The Thought Follower is very different. I've talked to creatives, economists, elite athletes, CEOs, venture capitalists, and a bunch more along the way. You never quite know what you're going to get, so make sure you subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode. Get back to the chat. The podcast is The Thought Follower, so thought leadership is the central theme. What does thought leadership mean to you?
So I think I've always liked the idea of thought leadership, and it might be because I started my career as a journalist, but I think the idea of thought leadership is to take a collection of information or intelligence and use it to create a new starting point for an idea. So I think, there is such a thing as an original thought, but I think the idea of leadership with thought is to say, here's an idea, or here's something that you might conclude or deduct from a collection of ideas that starts a conversation. So I think good thought leaders create a nucleus for something that gets people thinking in a different way, or sometimes allows people to look at issues from a different vantage point. So I think it's a really important thing. But I love that you're doing this podcast around thought leadership, because I think it's probably underdone as a topic in its own right. But to me, it's about creating a new nucleus of thought or pulling strands together to get us thinking in a different way.
That's interesting. And you mentioned you see it as important. I agree with that. I think it's important because I believe to an extent, everyone is a thought leader, whether it's with your children or your partner, the one person that you manage at work or the 500 people that you manage at work. If thoughts that you have influence others to feel and think in different ways, you're a thought leader. And for me, all that kind of differs then is the sphere of influence that you have. But fundamentally, we're all probably leading someone else's thoughts. And so being conscious of that is really important. There's lots out there. Who's one thought leader that you follow and why?
There's quite a few that I follow. One of the thought leaders that I follow is Professor Ruth Bridgestock from Swinburne University. She's done a lot of work in what she calls transdisciplinary jobs. And when I've written about this, I call them stretch jobs. So this is a new way of looking at the workforce, where we've traditionally said you're a lawyer or an accountant, you have some individual vocation. Ruth's research is starting to show that more and more people are doing multi-vocations. So that might mean you work for a company and you have 3 or 4 quite distinct jobs, but it's all within the one framework of a full-time or part-time job. Or it may be that you're, say you're an accountant, but you're also the expert on, say, drone technology, or the expert on some overseas market. But it's what they call key qualifications. So we traditionally have a whole lot of horizontal qualifications, which is just basics on using a computer and being able to do PowerPoint, etc. And then a deep vertical vocation, which is what we're generally known for. But in the key world, there's an expectation that we have deeper qualifications across a broader range of things. And that's really where employment's going. I like her work because I think it actually gets us into some different thinking again around breaking down some of these traditional barriers around what is a job, and do jobs really have to be structured based on some old world industrial model.
I feel as though, like for me personally, I've always wrestled with this idea of what do I want to spend 40, 50 hours a week doing forever? And I haven't come up with a good answer for that. Yeah. And that has changed. It might be over a 6-month period or a 12-month, or this idea that you sequentially do one thing and then go and try something else, and they're all separate paths and you need to just choose one to go all the way down the end of, has just never felt right for me and the way that the world is. So I love that idea, and it comes out in how people often function now, is that they are, as you're saying, they're skilled in a whole bunch of different areas. At the moment, they may not necessarily be paid or remunerated for other skills that they have, but why not bring those into kind of the mix of their employment and their role? I think that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the one related to that is the rise of portfolio careers. So this is people who deliberately have several jobs, and they with different employers or they might sit on boards and work 2 or 3 days, run their own business. So I think particularly with young people, a lot of the international research now is showing that anything up to 60% of that sort of Gen Z generation aspire to work for themselves rather than an employer. And that's off the charts higher than anything we've seen before. And that will change everything. That group are probably going to have 70-year careers because they'll probably live post 100. So you're not going to be retiring at 65. That just will be ridiculous. All these things come together where you say multiple careers, multiple jobs, which I don't think is a negative. I think it just makes working life a whole lot more interesting and a whole lot more diverse.
Yeah, and it's probably, I think I spend a good amount of time on LinkedIn, and a lot of that stock standard advice you'll see is find something that doesn't feel like work and do that. It's probably not far from the truth. That is what we're going to need to do to be able to put 70 years worth of life into what we call work, because if you're not enjoying it, you just won't last that long. Go on.
Oh, no, I think that's absolutely true. I think if you believe some of the statistics, up to 70% of people dread going to work every day. And you delve into that, and it's this issue we talked about earlier around a career being a marathon, not a sprint. I find a lot of people, particularly when they get to their 40s and 50s, they've actually loved their job over a period of time, but they get exhausted by it and they stop finding the joy in it. So I think part of the issue is how do you keep finding joy in work? And I think increasingly too, corporations are realising that workers are looking for purpose in their jobs. It's not just about filling a gap and earning money. It's actually feeling like you've done something. So the earning money and the idea of even a company making money is secondary to what are we doing that actually contributes to the world or contributes to a better world.
Have you found that answer for yourself of finding joy through your work?
It's a really good question. I think I know now what drives me, and it's taken a really long time, and I've changed jobs a lot, and generally not because I've set out to do that. I like words, and I love the power of words to make people think, to your points around thought leadership, to actually provide thought leadership around taking an idea and giving it a voice, if you like. So for me, my passion has always been writing. So I think in my career, it's almost gone full circle. That's where I started, but now that's really what I get a lot of enjoyment out of and joy. The other thing I think at this stage of my career, pulling strands together. So I've done media and writing, I've done marketing and brand, I've done business strategy. So now I think pull all those strands together and try to create something unique and interesting that does all three. So I think in a sense, sometimes that's just using your experience up to that point to do something that really pulls all the best bits together.
Is there anything you do away from work, whether that's physical health or mental fitness, things like that, to energize and keep that joy coming at when you're at work, so to speak?
Yeah, so I think it's really important, and again, I discovered this late in life, but to give your mind some air. And I think also to give yourself permission to have some downtime, because I think that's another lot of the feedback I get from the sort of writing I do, where people are saying, look, I'm just tired and I don't feel I can give myself permission to have downtime. And this is largely a function of the set metric that every human deals with is 24 hours in the day. And if you look at, particularly since probably about 2005, the number of options for a human to fill their day has just gone off the charts. So a lot of people struggle with that. So to me, to force yourself to rest, and also sometimes the best time to give yourself a rest is when you're the busiest, where you just say, okay, I need to empower myself to do that. I make sure I have exercise time, and I also make sure I have at least 15 to 20 minutes at the start of every day where I'm just thinking, giving myself just a little bit of room and air to think about the day, because even that little bit is enough to just give my brain enough room, if you like, to do something that's beyond just transactional day-to-day tasks.
Yeah, I love that idea. It's one of those things that I personally try and achieve every day, but it's so tempting now with your phone attached to your hand to just quickly jump into email or LinkedIn or whatever it might be, and you're instantly on that reactive. You're on the treadmill then, and you've started your day. So starting the day that way, I think, is a great idea. One thing in the book you talk about, coming back to, I guess, your article and the career advice you wish you had when you were 25. You, in the book, then talk about you've managed hundreds of people over a good long career. Have the skills that are needed to manage those 25-year-olds today, like today's millennials and Gen Z, do you think those skills are different to managing the 25-year-olds when your career started?
I think the short answer is yes. And I suppose the question is it skills, or is it the way that we approach, the way we treat employees? Because I think there's been a lot of work globally around the whole nature of trust, and a bit of a feeling that a lot of the way we've managed workforces over time has been sending a subtle message that we don't trust you. You must come in the office. We must see you. You must log in. You must tell us what you're doing. So very much based on a transactional approach to the number of hours you're working, without too much focus on what are you producing and what's the best way for you to be productive to give us the best outcome. So I think, in a sense, the big change is trusting people, like picking people well and trusting them to do the job and empowering them to make decisions without instructing them to make decisions. I think that's the big change. And I think there's a really big open-ended conversation going on at the moment around post-pandemic. How do we evolve management to deal with the way that the contemporary workforce wants to work? Because we're seeing a lot of this sort of messy stuff where people are being forced into the office against their will in a lot of cases. And it's probably not necessary. It's asking the wrong question. The question should be, what is the best way for a person to work on this particular day to get the best output for them and the organisation?
Yeah, it's the trust piece is so key to it. I look back and think about sitting exams and having like invigilators and things trying to stop people from cheating, but you could always go to the bar if you really wanted to. If someone forces you into the office, you can still shirk and not perform at your best if you're really not there. Same, obviously, at home, it's potentially even easier, but it does all boil down to trust. And when an employee, like, and I know this for myself, if I'm empowered, if I am responsible and accountable for the outcome, I'll need to get stuff done. And that's what makes me do stuff. It's not about where I'm located. It's not about who's breathing down my neck. It's much more that sense of empowerment and accountability that this is going to be on me. The result of this exam, the success of this project, this campaign launch, whatever it might be, I'm responsible for that. I'm accountable for that. I've got everything I need to deliver. So whether I spend time in the evening or I start late or I'm at home or at work, it's really just what's the result that I need to deliver. It's a huge shift.
Yeah, I agree. And a lot of this is about this mistaken belief that if you make people further up the line responsible for everything, you get a better result. And you get a lot of people ask questions as, does your organisation have a high tolerance for mistakes? And a lot of people say, oh no, we're too good for that and we set a higher standard. When people ask the question about tolerance for mistakes, what they really mean is, are you willing to trust people to make calls and live with the fact that occasionally they might make a mistake? And that's very different because, as you rightly point out, when the buck stops with someone, people step up and they really take it seriously. Whereas if they know the next layer of management is ultimately responsible, they can step back a little bit and say, I'll outsource that responsibility up the line. And that's how often corporations come really unstuck, because everyone's outsourced it up the line. By the time the ultimate responsibility sits with the CEO or something, they're the person least likely to know the detail of a decision being made.
Yeah. It certainly has happened in hierarchical organisations that I've been in where you do see that, and it's just the paper shuffling, and I've gotten this to a point, but my boss is going to look over it and they always change it anyway. I'll just get it to a point and move on. I want to talk about innovation as related to that this idea of failing and not getting everything right. Failure is a part of innovation. And I've seen the most innovative companies in the world almost measure themselves on how much they are failing, because that means they're trying new things. They're trying to do something no one's ever done before, so they'll fail. How do you view innovation in the context of today's workforce?
So I think there's a lot of furphies around innovation. It's an overused word. I think almost every company say, oh, we're innovative, we're trying to be innovative. In the real world, some are, but plenty are talking about it and doing nothing about it. And I think the enemy of innovation is incubation. That is, there's lots of ideas kicking around, but most business as usual organizational structures are not geared for the amount of extra energy it takes to introduce something new. And I often talk about mid-air refueling of companies. So you don't get the luxury in a contemporary organization to stop and change, like the old change management processes. Now you really have to mid-air refuel, which means you've got to have innovation accompanied by incubation. So these fast-moving processes that run in parallel to business as usual that can then feed an innovation back into a company and do it in such a way that, if you imagine it's like putting a new organ into a body, you need to do it in such a way that the body does not reject the new organ. Otherwise, the innovation fails, which is often the experience. And I think a lot of companies say, oh yeah, we like to give people a chance to fail, but they don't live that. They'll really not give people the feeling that they can fail and it'll be okay. And also a lot of high performers, the idea of failure is just so foreign to them. They're so used to succeeding. So it's a fraud area. I think the really great companies genuinely embrace failure, but I think the difference is they succeed more than they fail, and they fail early, often, and correct quickly. So I think they don't keep flogging dead horses. And I think there's a subtle difference in there between success and failure.
Yeah, that link, high performance, I look at it from a sporting context. It's about winning. It's about winning the gold medal, winning the grand final, whatever it might be. But failure, again, being necessary parts of getting to the very highest echelons. Is that a mental thing that you can coach into people or help support them around that at work?
Look, I think to a point, but I think it still comes down to the culture of the organisation. I think if you look at, say take medical research, of course you have to fail in that because it's all about trying things. So I think people in those experimental type industries where it really is about trial and error. Yeah, you literally, the error is as important as the trial. And it's only the things that don't work that help you narrow the scope enough to eventually find things that do work. And I think I've talked about Thomas Edison saying that it took him 10,000 goes to get the light bulb right. And it was the whole thing of, I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that didn't work. But by a process of elimination, that moved him closer to things that do work.
Yeah, it's a powerful one. It sticks out, doesn't it, that quote? Look, probably the core question of this show, do you see yourself as a thought leader?
I don't. To me, it sounds almost arrogant to see yourself as a thought leader, but I think in a sense I like to see myself as a thought disruptor, which is probably the same thing. So I think there's almost an arrogance around leadership where you say, I'm taking a thought and I'm leading people somewhere with it. To me, I like the idea of floating a thought, floating an idea, floating a concept, and then letting others grab that and do something with it. Like I say, in a sense, that is leadership. But I certainly love the idea of disruptive thinking, looking at things from different vantage points and challenging the status quo and just some of the things that we accept as part of our norm that actually, if you go back to it, don't make much sense. And I think if you look in the space I write, this whole idea of retiring at 65 doesn't make sense anymore in that sense. This whole idea of FaceTime and working ridiculously hard and then getting to your deathbed and regretting it. This whole idea of no one on their deathbed ever said, I wish I spent more time at the office. There's a whole lot of stuff where you think, of course, but we do it anyway. I think in a sense, challenging people on those issues and saying, look, seriously, what is it you really want? You've only got one life. What do you actually want to do with it? If I can provide thought leadership on challenging that thinking, yeah, in that respect, I'm happy to be a thought leader.
Hey, it's me again. If you made it this far, I'm guessing you're enjoying the chat. Don't forget to give the Thought Follower a rating and share it with your friends. Otherwise, reach out to me on LinkedIn with any guest suggestions or feedback on the show. I'd love to hear from you. Let's get back to the episode.
You wrote your article about the advice that you wish you had at 25, and there's a line there where you say, I remember every single concert or presentation or whatever it was. I remember every single one I missed, but not a single reason I missed them. Is there a sense of kind of regret or anything you do different? Given you wrote the article a little bit later in life, you had some of those hard learnings. Would you do it differently again?
Yeah. And look, I hate the idea of regrets because I think the trouble is if you regret, what's the point? You can't go back. All you can do is deal with today and deal with the future. Short answer is yes. I would not have worked so hard. Some of the ridiculous hours I put in on jobs, when I look back now and think, really, nobody remembers that. There's no great value. And in a sense, I probably would have worked a whole lot better working less hours and doing them in a smarter way, or I might have been more productive. I might have done a lot more things that contributed to the world. So yeah, in that respect, sure. But look, let's face it, at the end of the day, the past is gone. So I make the point at the end of the book that in that original LinkedIn article, I talked about the day when we'll have a time machine and we'll be able to go back and give advice to our 25-year-old self. The point I make in the book is we already have a time machine because we've already lived those number of years. We can already go back and see what was happening 10, 20 years ago and apply it to the future. And I think that's probably the more relevant learning from time.
And so in your current role at your business, a business called Roland, do you bring that ethos? Like the 25-year-olds that work in that business, are they empowered by your published attitude to this? How do you bring it to life today?
Yeah, look, I can't speak for them. I think that whole generation thinks differently anyway. And I think a lot of them, particularly here, are very hard workers and put in a lot of time, but I also think they do value their downtime, they value their break time. And I also think with career, they think in shorter increments. So I think if they're in a learning mode or a high experience mode, they might be deliberately putting in extra time and extra energy, but they'd be quite happy then to go on the back burner for a while and do something different or take 6 months off. And the number of young people you see now who take a year off and it's not even a traditional gap year. It's just I've done this bit for a while. Now I'm just going to go and do something completely different for a while. I think we're going to see that. I think you'll see people fast lane, slow lane, no lane. So I think people have given themselves permission now in those younger generations to not live like their parents and grandparents and feel like you flog yourself for 40 years, you retire and then hope you live long enough to enjoy retirement. I think that's gone.
Yeah. I think looking at this specifically for myself as a parent, and if I look at my parents, a lot of the motivation I feel was that financial piece of that's how you provide for a family is making a good living and building a traditional career that financially supports your family. I still feel, especially the way property prices in Australia are, that hasn't gone away. That's probably the tension that I feel is how do I earn a crust and kind of give myself that a financial or material life that I want to have, I want my kids to have, without doing all those things that you talked about, burning out and overworking and things like that. Do you have any advice for people walking that tightrope?
I think everyone's life is different. I think my only really useful observation is people tend to live the life that's expected of them. It's easy to get caught up in a feeling that there's no choice. Got to earn this much money, got to live in this suburb, got to do this type of job, got to do that this year, otherwise I'll fall off the progression route wheel. That's such an easy thing to fall into. But equally, I so often get contact from people who said, look, we just went out to the regions and bought a cheap house and we just got permission from our employer to work remotely. We come in every few months to connect. We sat down and worked out how much money do we really need, and it was actually a lot less than we thought. It's really a matter of really being honest about what's important to you. And some people, the lifestyle and the money and where they live, it's a priority for a period of time. But I'm always amazed when people make a really proactive decision to live differently and they really sit down and say, what would that really look like? Most of them find a way. And I think it's just giving yourself permission to say, okay, I'm not stuck in these rigid parameters. There are other ways to live and other people have done it. And interesting, I also know a lot of people who've ended up making more money that way too, because they've eased back, got some time, got some thinking, done some side hustles and actually ended up creating a better financial position for themselves. It doesn't always happen, but sometimes you create that bit of room and suddenly your brain thinks in different ways.
So so you've now published a book. You mentioned right at the beginning of your career, before you started career, fascinated by words and wanted to be a writer. Was that act of publishing a book, did that scratch that itch? Is that it? Is there more to come? What's your attitude there?
It's really interesting. I can't even remember why I wrote the book, but I think it was because when I wrote that LinkedIn article, that when you write something that over 6 million people read and 11,000 people commented on and 300,000 people liked, and you get comments from all over the world, you think there's something in there. So for me, I think as a writer, I felt obliged to do something else with it, because it felt to me there was a large number of people out there who were really making a cry for help, a genuine heartfelt cry for help to give them permission to think a little bit of a different way. So that was really where the book started. And then I think they say with writing, you really should write about things you know. So when I think about what do I know, because I've been in management roles since I was in my 20s, I've done a lot of observation around what actually happens in the workplace, humans, how they react, how things play out. So I think if you're going to leave a mark on the world, it doesn't really matter if nobody reads it. For me, it's about trying to add something to the sum of human knowledge / thought, if you like, to make some of these things worthwhile.
So there's something I want to touch on. You mentioned when I asked if you feel like you're a thought leader, and you felt arrogant in saying that. I would look at it from the outside and say your thoughts have been responded to and engaged with by millions of people worldwide. Imposter syndrome is a term that's thrown around a lot. I would look at it more as like your humility to an extent. Is there a relationship there, like feeling humble and not wanting to be arrogant versus imposter syndrome? Would you describe it in any way like that for yourself?
Yeah, look, I think absolutely, because I think unless you have a really large ego, the idea of writing a book or going onto LinkedIn and saying, these are my thoughts on this, or this is the advice I would give you. I struggled with that for a long time, because I really thought, what advice can I give that I can be sure is of use to people? But then I think I reconciled it by thinking, you put it out there and you say, there's nothing, I'm not doing this for any personal end. The writing I've done on LinkedIn has purely been to share thoughts. And I think in the early days, I said, I'm just writing this for myself. I'll put it out there in case other people find it interesting. But a lot of it was around sending messages to myself about the way I was thinking about particular issues. So I think in that sense, I overcame my natural, I don't know if humility is the right word, but the idea that who would care what I think. But you're right, imposter syndrome, most people have some version of. And I think if you look at presidents of the United States, you read a lot of their autobiographies, and that day where they suddenly realise they're running the free world, and there's no degree for that. You've just got to hope that you've got something in your experience and skills that makes you good at the job.
Have you experienced imposter syndrome over your career?
Yeah, pretty much every job I've ever had. But I think you tend to have imposter syndrome when you stretch yourself into new places. So I think probably less so when I was in journalism, because I've been trained in that. I've done it a lot and I felt pretty confident. But I stretched journalism into marketing and communications and brand, and then into business and business strategy and change management. I kept pushing myself into places where it was less my base and less my comfort zone. So I think probably I had imposter syndrome in all of those, but I learned pretty quickly there's nothing particularly special around it. If you're well read and you're well experienced, you can fake it or make it in almost everything.
I've got a theory that's forming that imposter syndrome is only going to increase in prevalence, because I think we're more self-aware and self-reflective than ever. We're probably more focused about our perception by others more than ever. But also, as the rate of change increases, you talked about that area of being in a stretch role, being in an environment where you're not trained necessarily to solve the specific problem that you're responsible now for solving, because the problem of COVID didn't exist 3 years ago, and now that's been solved. I think as the rate of change increases, we're going to be more and more in those situations of completely uncharted territory. But maybe that's the case throughout humanity. What do you think?
Look, I think your observation that it gets more pronounced is probably right, but it also might mean our expectations around having very specific qualifications or skills will become less, because I think you've got to be realistic now. We're seeing in the employer space that people just aren't trained for some of the jobs that have been created now, because there's no degree for it. Jobs get created that didn't exist a year ago. There's just these systems to produce those skills through a formal sense just don't exist anymore. So I think increasingly you're looking at flexible, smart people who can make things happen, adapt, and just move with the world. So hopefully imposter syndrome will become less and people will get the confidence to say, I'm smart enough to work this stuff out.
We've touched, and a lot of your experience is in the professional field, the world of work. Something, again, as a dad of young kids, something that's bubbling away in my mind is how fit for purpose the current education system is to create those smart, flexible, adaptive people. My gut feeling is it's not at the moment. It's hopefully changing quite quickly. Have you seen anything changing in that space?
Look, I think there's a lot of good intentions in the space, but I think the structural inertia in our education and vocation systems and higher education systems is so strong that the rate of change is really slow relative to what's required. And I think there's two issues. One is the old structures around degrees that take 4 years and give you theoretical basis for things. I think the nature of what we learn in schools, and really, is that right anymore? But the other the one that probably worries me the most is the pathways. I think the pathways from school to higher education are fractured. It's too big a jump. And if you look at the dropout rates, I think it's about 1 in 5 students drop out of their course in the first year of university. There's something missing in that transition based on where we are now. And perhaps even more worrying at a time when there's actually quite a few jobs around for the moment. It could change, but there's quite a few jobs, but you still have quite high unemployment for young people, which means even though we've got lots of jobs, that pathway from higher ed into the workforce is still not strong. We haven't created great pathways. So not only do we have a system that's languishing behind the rate of change around what the economy needs and probably what the world needs, but you're having fractured pathways to move between the institutions.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight. I'd never looked at it that way. Any solutions?
I think in the school to university, I think there may be a transition zone we have to create, because I think rather than going directly from school into a specific vocation, I think you probably see the rise of philosophy and arts and some of those more generic things. And maybe needs another transition year, which is actually about some broader skills that everybody needs. This sort of understanding of history and philosophy, broader understanding of how digital powers the economy, a deeper understanding of business, given such a huge proportion of young people want to run their own businesses. There's probably some more generic skills where it's not quite right to do that in schools, and it's too early to specialise in university. So I think there is a new zone of transition that has to be created there. And I think the transition from higher ed to employment is probably about, again, another crossover zone. So almost a demilitarised zone between the two, where you've got employers more deeply involved in what's happening at universities and universities more deeply understanding what's happening in work. Because there's always a friction around, are they there to get people work ready, or are they there just to educate people? But I think at the moment the disconnect is so strong, and we're losing people in the middle, that it requires a different approach.
It is interesting that from uni to, or higher education into that first role, and this idea of the internship and the grad program being so highly sought after, and a lot of competition around that, but all centred on essentially what are your results at university? What marks are you getting in the subjects that you're studying, versus are you that smart, flexible person that's going to come in and actually add value, or be able to soak up as much value as you can from day one. I think it's such a, in a more remote world now, where in the old days you would walk in as an intern and you would shadow someone around, you would sit in meetings and kind of by osmosis pick a lot more things up. But maybe now in a more remote setting, those people, if they're not work ready, how are they bridging that gap much more on their own?
Yeah, and I think that is going to be one of the big questions of the next 5 years, because, and there's two schools of thought on this. One is that there's been a subtle training that's been happening in workplaces once people transition in, where it may not even be formal training, but they're picking up nuances, they're watching people, they're observing, they're sitting in meetings and they're learning from other people. And I think that certainly happens. There's also plenty of other schools of thought and research that says we overrate that, and it may be that the skills around working remotely, finding your own solutions, not waiting for things to happen, but actually going and proactively finding out for yourself could be just as important. So I think we're in a bit of a shakeout zone at the moment, where there's no universal right or wrong around these things. We're just working it out, and nobody much has worked it out yet, I think.
It's interesting. Shane, it's been really good to chat to you and hear more. Quite a surreal moment from that article that I read years ago and started following you way back then to actually sit and chat through everything that's happened. So well done on getting the book out, Worknado. I'll drop a link to it on the podcast. But thank you for your time.
No, thanks, Joe. Absolute pleasure to talk to you. Hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Shane.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to support me or the show, best way is to subscribe or follow wherever you listen to podcasts. And please get in touch with me on LinkedIn. Love to hear from you with any guest recommendations or feedback on the show. See you on the next one.